Okay, hi everyone. I think we can start the following talks. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Nick Jackson, who will join us in person today. And Dr. Jackson is an assistant professor of chemistry at Illinois. And
Great, thanks for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. It's the first time I've been out of my house in about a month because I have a newborn. So I might fall asleep. I might give a great talk. Nobody knows. Today I'm going to talk about some generative design on the macromolecular genome. I'll tell you what that means in a second. So what does my group do? Just to give you a base introduction here, my group works on polymers. We're a computational and theoretical group. I break it down loosely into traditional polymer properties and electronic polymer properties. What does that mean? Traditional polymer properties that people are interested in are things like moduli, rheology, solubility, thermal transport properties, kind of the whole thing that got all the 1950s on polymer industry going. The things my group is really excited about trying to predict that are, I would say, a bit more challenging are things related to the electronic structure. So conductivity, optical properties, dielectric breakdown, or a few photostability is something in the MMLI we're working on, certainly. And the main point is that we want to be able to predict and design polymeric materials like these, things for sensors, electronics, displays, neural interfaces, all these applications where, the original thought that plastics are insulating is kind of removed, and you can start endowing some pretty cool functionality into polymeric materials. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view of what my group is interested in working on. We're a modeling group, so we don't do experiments for the safety of others. We work in a variety of modeling regimes, and this is what makes polymer design so challenging, is that if you want to design the electronic properties of polymers, you need quantum mechanical solutions, which requires things where you know where all the atoms are, techniques, solving the Schrodinger equation, density functional theory, etc. You also need to understand things like mesoscopic ordering that are important for rheology and structuring. So that requires kind of your bead spring coarse grain model approaches that you see a lot in the polymer literature. And then, of course, if you want to get really macroscopic and realistic, you need to start thinking at a continuum level. And so the big challenge with polymer design from a computational perspective is that if you want a flexible thing that's absorbing light and working as a neural interface, you have to be able to design across all three of these scales. And each of these is kind of its own little house of challenges from a computational perspective. So that's the big scheme. First two slides here, kind of what my group focuses on. So now we get to the meat of the matter. The meat of the matter is if I want to design a polymer for any of these given properties, so I have arbitrary physical property labeled by a color bar up here, and say I have two polymeric properties that are common to tune, the molecular weight of the polymer and the side chain length. This is an extreme simplification because anybody who's done molecular design knows that in fact it's a multi-target, multi-fidelity optimization over multiple parameters, including chemical space. It's a hard problem, so this is a dramatic simplification. But the dream, if I were designing this, would be I would be able to sample anywhere in this space with copious high-quality experiments and data sets. But the reason this institute exists is because that dream is difficult. So I can spend a lot of time, a few months, generating a few points on this optimization surface, but it's so multidimensional and it's so challenging that the question is, where do these 3 points really get me at the end of the day? And so the problem is that it's expensive and time consuming. So the resolutions, a resolution I will say that somebody like me likes to think about are twofold. The first is the question of how do we generate additional points on this optimization surface quickly and cheaply. So I'm in the business of multi-scale simulations. So if you think about what a multi-scale simulation might tell you in the design process, it could let you populate this design space much more quickly and kind of figure out where the troughs and the peaks are. And then what I'm going to talk about today is this question of, well, once we have the points that we have measured or computed, where do we go and how do we design materials most efficiently based on that? So in my group, we work on AI, machine learning, whatever you'd like to call it, in materials discovery from two perspectives. So this is kind of on the left here, in your left little square, you have the canonical Edisonian materials discovery approach, if you will. So you start with the materials concept, which is typically, I thought this thing was cool, and so let's work on it. You come up with some ideas, you synthesize a new structure, you make a device, you test it. And then, what do? Your brain, your human brain comes up with some sort of a gradient in conceptual space and you decide, okay, I think I'm going to move along this descriptor because that's going to get me closer to my target. In my group, we kind of focus on two approaches that incorporate AI. The first is in trying to make this how you go from materials concept to the thing you're going to make via computation a little more accelerated and a little more rigorous and high powered. So a big thing in my group we work on is this technique called electronic coarse graining. I'm not going to dive into that today, but there's a lot of cool machine learning work that goes into it. What I'm going to talk about today is the second part. How do you leverage the information that you have and the data sets that exist to basically facilitate that loop that used to be Edisonian that you now want to make as systematic and mathematically and quantitative as you possibly can. And the thing I'm going to talk about today is called the open macromolecular genome. And so let's get into that. The motivation for what I'm going to tell you about today, we've seen a lot of great talks, a lot of really fascinating computer science talks on the generative design process for molecules. So I don't really need to prep that too much, but I'll just start with the classic, which is from the Asperger group, use of a variational autoencoder. So you map small molecules to a latent space, you search in the latent space and you reproject out the molecules. This has transformed small molecule design all over the place, as we've seen today. But the big point of today's talk is that whenever you see these outstanding computer science methods, you have to ask yourself, where does the data come from? And if you dive into it, the data comes from a handful of locations. I can probably fit them all on both hands. Typically, you see things like GDB, Zinc, QM9. And if you're not familiar with these data sets, GDB, for example, GDB 13 enumerates small organic molecules up to 13 atoms via simple chemical stability and synthetic pathway rules. You get about on the order of, 900 million, a billion of these things. And so the question here, I'm in the business of polymers, remember, that's what I'm primarily interested in. So the question I have to ask here from the transferability perspective is, if I want to do generative design on polymers, do the polymer chemistries that I'm interested in, that industry is interested in, do those look sufficiently like all of these data sets that I'm building my entire workflow off of that I can expect reasonable candidates to emerge? That's the big point. Remember that. And so the point of this talk is, if you want to, Venn diagrams, I've never used a Venn diagram until now, but we'll see how it goes. So if you think about it, you have your existing ML chemical space filled with data sets like GDB, small molecule drug-like data sets, great data sets. We've learned a lot from them. And you think about what synthetic polymer chemistries look like, things like polyethylene, polypropylene. You probably want to make them degradable in the future. So you're going to start putting some CO bonds in there, et cetera. The question is, what is my overlap between these two chemical spaces look like? And so you can make the argument that, yeah, well, if you use the drug data sets and the small molecule data sets, you'll access a huge diversity of chemical space that you were never in before. But then on the other hand, you have the argument that, well, what kind of practical, chemically realizable industry solutions are you going to derive from a small molecule training set that just looks like a bunch of drug molecules? And so what we aim to do is we aim to basically have a data set that increases this overlap so that we have chemical diversity from small molecule data sets, but at the same time, we also feed in a lot of common synthetic polymer chemistries such that we can actually reach desirable parts of chemical space that are accessible synthetically for, say, a polymer chemist. And this all comes down again to this idea of transferability. If you train your generative algorithm on a drug-like data set, can I apply that to design polymers tomorrow? Typically, the answer is not really, and we're seeking to improve this. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. The open macromolecular genome and manipulations thereof is work by my and Professor Schroeder's first year math sci student, Songhwan Kim, doing some great stuff with us in just his first year. And so we set out here, and the aim that we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, before we try to do generative design on polymers, macromolecules, first we need a data set. And so what kind of a data set is going to enable these generative models that we're all interested in? We want it to be specific to synthetic polymers, so it can have drug-like polymer chemistries and small molecules, but we also want those kind of canonical polymer chemistries that we see everywhere, that's on the back of a plastic bottle, that type of stuff. On, what is this made out of? It doesn't look like a drug-like molecule. We want them to be chemically realizable, so if I make them, it's not some far venture into synthetic space that would require somebody like Marty Burke to, have a grad student spend 5 years synthesizing it. We want something very, very accessible in the short term, that if a synthetic chemist looked at it, they would say, yeah, okay, that's sensible. We could make that. We want it synthetically accessible specifically so that when we draw the chemical structure, not only is it reasonable, we also say, okay, yeah, you could get there by like a step growth polymerization with, say, these two types of chemistries. And of course, we want chemical diversity so we can really increase the scope of our search space as much as we possibly can. So what is the Open Macromolecular Genome, the OMG, if you will? It is a data set that we have scraped from a variety of sources. So what we did was we went to Sigma Aldrich, eMolecules, and the National Institute of Material Science in Japan. And we wrote a bunch of scripts that said, okay, we're going to go into these databases, take out all of the monomer chemistries that we can. And then what we're going to say is, okay, what are the canonical sets of polymerization reactions that are used in the literature? So if I open up Tim Loge's polymer chemistry book and I flip through the first 10 reactions, what are those reactions that are like the canonical ones you teach? And so we aggregated by, looking through some books and talking to some synthetic chemists, these kind of common sets of addition, ring opening, and condensation reactions. And so then we scraped through these 3 databases and we said, give me every monomer that contains the following atoms at the top, that does not have salts, and that has the functionalities necessary to perform any of the following sets of polymerization reactions. So for example, we went through and you would find these 2 monomer reactants on the left that could form this condensation reaction and make this kind of ester on the right. And the aim here, I just want to be as concrete as possible from the get-go. The aim here is linear homopolymers. You might say that's kind of boring, but I'll address this at the end. And these sets of reactions. So it's a well-defined synthetic scope, but I'm going to see where that scope gets. I'm going to show you where that scope gets us from the get-go. So if you do that, if you scrape 24 million molecules and you start looking at, how many of these different reactants do I have if I want to kind of abide by these traditional polymerization chemistries, you get out, if you start sorting them according to how big they are, how many heavy atoms they have in them, you'll see, you get on order of, for 0 to 10, you'll get, on the order of hundreds or thousands. As you start increasing the number of heavy atoms, you start really boosting these quantities into these really impressive areas. Of course, if you start thinking now, about condensation reactions, well, if I have on order, 10 to the 5 of say a dicarboxylic acid and a diol, I can combinatorically combine all these on order of, say, billions. And this starts getting into these scopes of data sets. I remember, or if you remember, I said at the beginning, these small molecule data sets, GDB, are these systematic enumerations of up to 13 atoms, and they give you billions of molecules. And if you're training a generative algorithm and you want to learn chemical space, you really do need on order of millions or billions of molecules. So this gives us, for any given kind of polymerization reaction we're interested in, that order of polymer chemistries that we can just jump in with any generative model. I'm not going to say the generative models I show you today are the best generative models on Earth, but we've seen today a lot of really impressive generative model work that you could adapt onto this chemical data set and move forward in the polymer synthesis direction. So the goal here is that we made this data set to freely enable generative polymer design, not just small molecule design. So this is a dangerous thing for a theorist to show a bunch of reactions that we've chosen up here. And I'm extremely happy to get feedback on this after the talk. But this is kind of our canonical set that, if you look through all the synthetic polymer chemistries, you can make a huge number of them out of these kind of simple sets of reactions. And so we have all of these reactions coded up in our database. So we have the Open Macromolecular Genome, which is on order millions or billions of chemistries and their reactants. We have written codes that will do automatic polymerization reactions of any combinations of the associated reactants corresponding to these 17 reactions. And so now the question is, we have this enormous data set of reactants and this enormous data set of polymers that can be made out of them. What can we do with it that would be useful to anybody? And so now you get into the generative design world that has been discussed a fair amount to this point. And so what Song Hwan and I and Professor Schroeder have been doing is we've started with a generative architecture that you might be familiar with. It's called Molecule Chef. It's out of the Alan Turing Institute at Cambridge. it has some really nice, simple properties that we can build off of, which is why we selected it. And so if you think about, the basic 2-sentence kind of version of this is if you think of original kind of generative design models on the left, you have a mapping from your chemistries to a latent space, and then you decode that latent space into a selected molecule chemistry. The idea of the molecule chef is that you have your latent space, but your latent space is a representation of all of the reactants required to make the chemistry at the end of the day that you're interested in making. And so it decodes not into a single molecular structure, but into a series or a set of reactants, of monomer bags of reactants that can be used to make your polymer or your molecule. And so the big point of this is that we can do all of the generative design strategies as before, search in the latent space and output the chemistry of interest. But instead of outputting the end chemistry, we output the reactant chemistry first, and then we have our sets of polymerization reactions that can turn that into a polymer at the end of the day. So this sets us up to do generative design on the sets of reactants required to make a polymer. And it's fundamentally encoded that the only polymers we can make correspond to reactions of those 17 reactions that have been coded in the OMG. If you want a little detail about what the molecule chef is, in reality, you should really interrogate Songhwan, but I'm happy to give you this overview here. It's a combination of a gated graph neural network, which gives you, we've heard a lot about graph neural networks today, so you can take away some of the big powers of those. But the idea is you have a set of reactant monomer bags. So you make a bunch of, say, pairs of different condensation reactions, and you make them invariant by summing them together, and then you map them via a variational process to a latent space. And then this is the big takeaway of what we want to do. We want to optimize our latent space, optimize our chemistries to a specific target physical property. So what do? We regress off of the latent space to the physical property of choice. So this can be anything. This can be solubility, electronic structure. Any data you have can be used, similar to previous generative design efforts. And then we decode off of the latent space back into sets of reactants. So again, this is all in terms of reactants. The only time the actual polymer chemistry comes in is at the actual polymer repeat unit comes in is at the end of the day when you take the reactants and shoot it into a polymer. So we can do all this design in the space of reactants. And just, the big takeaway here is all the reactants are real, derived from sources online. They're all taken from representative polymer chemistry, so they're not going to be so far off in synthetic space that they're just inconceivable. And the polymerization reactions are all sensible. And then at the end of the day, we have our coded sets of polymerization reactions, which I just belaboured. So let's show it in action a little bit here. Songhwan had the idea, this is a big data set. So what we'll start with step growth. Step growth is a nice straightforward application. Every polymer I've ever studied, I think, has been from a condensation reaction. So there we go. So you start with this. You take a set of all of the different monomers, all the different reactants from the different canonical chemical structures. You form about 6,000, 7,000 unique sets of monomers, and then you randomly mix them together to form monomer bags that you're going to feed to your molecule chef algorithm. So, we've taken a small subsampling of our entire chemical space. We are going to train a generative model to learn the reactants, the chemical structure of the reactants in that space. So now we have, say, 32,000 monomer bags that are combined according to these, condensation rules. We train our, okay, so this is the big point. So now the question is, the generative model can take in the monomer bags and output monomer bags again, but the big point of this is we want to design polymers with optimized physical properties. So that part I showed where we have regression off of the latent space for a specific structure property relationship. The question is, what am I going to start with to optimize the chemistries of my polymers? And what I'm going to do is relatively simple. I'm going to pick log P. So log P is just it's on the other slide, is the octanol water partition coefficient. It's a measure of solubility. It basically tells you if it's really large, it tells you that your chemistry is probably going to be hydrophobic. And if it's really small, it tells you it's probably going to be hydrophilic. And so what we do is we train our molecule chef architecture on this new data set, this subset of the OMG. And the idea is that we're, again, putting in the monomer bags, sorting the latent space according to their solubility, and outputting the monomer bags again. And then what Songhwan does is he takes this trained model and then he plops down some points in the latent space and he says, take me in the direction of highest solubility, highest log P, highest hydrophobicity, or take me in the direction of lowest log P, hydrophilicity. And then you land at a point and you output the reactants corresponding to that optimized log P value. Those reactants then hit the polymerization routines and out pops your polymer. And so if you just do this trivially, again, these chemistries, these are not theorists make up chemistries for the sake of it. These are real things you can purchase online. So monomer 1, monomer 2, diol and dichloric acid. If you look at this polymer here, it's taken towards a highly hydrophobic area. Obviously, you have those giant alkyl chains. Okay, you could say that's a little cheating. You just smack some alkyl chains on there, but it works, right? It gets you to that point in polymer chemistry space that you want to be. And it gives you the reactants at the end of the day that you could purchase and that you could try to synthesize according to a condensation reaction. Of course, every synthetic chemist in this room will say, well, what if it's not soluble in the right solvent? What temperature do I need to run it out? What catalysts? What's, all these challenging questions indeed. But, you're a lot further along the way than you would be normally. If you kind of sample over all log P space, high log P, hydrophobic, see those big conjugated backbones, don't dissolve that in water, it will not. You go down to say more hydrophilic chemistries, you get out these polymer chemistries, these repeat units and the associated monomers that could potentially be made from a condensation reaction. And again, this is, it's hard for me to emphasize how hot off the press this is. Songhwan is a first-year student, but he's an outstanding one. And we are, flying in this direction, making these chemistries. And where we really want to go in the future is towards any application for which we have a lot of experimental or computational data, right? So we all live in this data-starved world, which is something to think about. You see a lot of talks on advanced computer science methods that are incredibly important and I will be using in the future, no doubt. But at the end of the day, you're in a data-starved regime. And so that's why, when we started this project, we said, well, we need a data set that is massive and looks like polymer chemistries, because without that to train on, we can't get to where we want to be at the end of the day. And so our data set we have now enables generative design, but we have some, hypothetical areas we'd like to move into. And of course, the Molecule Maker Lab is the perfect place to be thinking about these types of problems, because if you want to generate large amounts of data, experimental data, we are working on the apparatus. So what I put here, of course, hypothetically, is we're the Molecule Maker Lab, but we could be the Macromolecule Maker Lab. And so moving forward in the future, this is something that we're going to, try to argue with you synthetic chemists about maybe potentially doing. Having this big unique data set for generative design and polymers and trying to move forward towards specific targets in this way. In the meantime, as theorists, 10 years ago, theorists didn't do a lot of machine learning. It was actually looked down upon. Alanis Piroguzik was one of the leaders who did it when he was looked down upon, and now he's the king of the world, which I think is fantastic. But it's, 10 years ago, these are the classic tools we have for designing in this area: quantum chemistry, MMD, and polymerism. So we can still use these to create large computational data sets moving forward. And this is our plan, in the next year, let's say. So now comes the criticism time of this talk, where there has been I've said this open macromolecular genome, it'll enable generative design. I just want to be concrete. You have to start somewhere, right? So if you are a polymer chemist or a polymer scientist, you are fully aware of all of the different variables that influence how a polymer performs, right? So the chemical structure, we got that. You can co-polymerize, sequence dependent, what have you. You have a molecular weight distribution, regioregularity, tacticity, processing parameters, what your morphology is, additives, plasticizers, is the fan on in the room, ambient conditions, all these types of things influence the processing of your material. And then similarly, what properties do you want to record to optimize? So in a perfect world, you would have a polymer database, a macromolecular genome that covers all of these areas. But I will just say, that is not a practical vision in the future. So what we've advocated for here is the first thing you need is the chemistries to help the generative design process. And then you need to couple yourself with high throughput experimentation to generate the data set for the specific application that you're interested in. So advocate for a case-by-case basis, because this space is just exponentially too much. It's too much, right, to get experiments covering all of these areas. And so, I've given a version of this talk, a couple versions of this talk before, and I think everybody, when they see a data set, they want their properties to be in there, but it's really a complicated thing for polymers. And so we're happy to move in these directions moving forward, but on a motivated case-by-case basis. So if you take away a few points from this talk, I hope you take away that the OMG is this new data set that we're cultivating in our group that allows for generative design of polymers. And the important point is that we include the capability for retrosynthetic suggestions. We'd love to improve on the complexity of those retrosynthetic suggestions in the future, but we've selected them right now and we think that they're a pretty good starting point. The generative models you can use to kind of facilitate design in the OMG. The molecule chef is something that we like. It's not the only generative model in the world. We are kind of get the job done, not use the fanciest model people. And so this is a powerful thing that we're going to use moving forward. At present, I showed these first applications to step growth. We have chain growth, ring opening, and some metathesis examples underway. And of course, we are working towards incorporating specific physical property from a computational sense, density functional theory calculations, et cetera. But ultimately in the future, we'd really like to land in the experimental data set regimes. So with that, I will wrap it up. This is my group. Again, Song Hwan Kim is the graduate student working on this. Charles Schroeder is our great collaborator who jointly advises Song Hwan. Funding is from there, and I'm of course thrilled to take questions. Stunned into silence.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
How do you think about the combinatorics?
Yeah.
So how does the molecule chef predict how A plus B is greater than the sum of their parts? And is there a way you can think about functional prediction that actually prospectively captures that combinatorial effect?
Yeah. So you're talking about like the emergence kind of new properties of the two. Yeah. So it's a good question. So it should be baked in there. So if you have a data set that measures, the polymer properties at the end of the day, so if the emergent properties manifest in your experimental data that you use to organize a latent space, it should be captured. To have, as you said, kind of like a prospective incorporation of that from the get-go. So yeah, right now, it's pretty dependent on the existing data set to organize a latent space according to that. So I don't have any clever off-the-cuff ideas there, but yeah.
I think it was a similar question to what Marty just asked, but so you mentioned molecular weight distribution, but just what also about just molecular weight? So like saying a ligament, 2 or 3 linkages or small ligament versus high molecular weight polymers, or would that also be accounted for in the input data set?
Yeah, so that's also great. So the philosophy we take is to be a little more concrete. So if you think about what polymer chemists and polymer physicists have conquered in the past 50 years, they've conquered a lot of areas that are molecular detail agnostic, right? Like, Ken Schweitzer, brilliant theories on mesoscopic ordering and rheology as a function of molecular weight and branching and all that. So kind of our approach here is that, the chemical unit optimization is the challenging thing that we really need the data-driven approach for. So, ideally, what we're kind of working off right now is that you can use these molecular structure agnostic theories to kind of start from the point of the monomer and then branch out towards predicting as a function of molecular weight distributions and molecular weight in the future. That's not to say that you can't incorporate all this data into our approach from the get-go. It's just to say that if you look out there, almost nobody has, because it's a huge pain. Oh, okay. You can unmute yourself, Scott.
Can you hear me, Nick?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. It's a terrific talk. I'm really impressed by this approach. One of the things I might advise is that as you're constructing the bags or the individual component monomers for building your polymers, I think you might want to do that in consultation with a synthetic chemist rather than wait until you have created your combinatorics and say, can we make these? I think what you put in, we've discovered this ourselves when we build these massive in silico libraries of hypothetical catalyst structures, and we end up finding things that we should never even have put in there in the first place. So I would really advise you, as you're building that up, to consult with people who can help you with synthesizability before you build this massive library.
Absolutely, yeah. So, completely agree. I don't want to fly blind. So the asterisk I'll put here is, so this, the synthetic choices we've made so far, we did, and in the background with some colleagues of mine at 3M, hence kind of the 3M block here. And so, from the polymerization front, we certainly have incorporated an element of that there, but I am not a synthetic chemist. I would love to work with as many synthetic chemists as possible to make sure that these things are not foolish structures. So point
Good.
taken.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's a really nice talk. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned one of the problems would be long-term isolating all the properties of all of the multitude of polymeric things you can make.
Sure.
But do you think there's any mileage in getting a head start on that by just finding the literature for all of the properties that are known for all of the monomers? Because a lot of those are probably going to be very well known for these simple carboxylic acids and all sorts of things like that.
Definitely.
And there'd be something translatable there for when you get the surprises, you'd know maybe where that comes from a block level.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a fair point. Okay, so literature mining is an interesting beast. Since I've been a part of a few of these efforts, and so anything that's PDF based before like 1990, you really struggle with pulling out the things in an automated, systematic fashion. Your fundamental point is an excellent one that I completely agree with.
I mean, there's resources like the spectral database, right? For lots of really simple small molecules.
Yeah,
that's probably pretty reliable.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure. No, so there's definitely directions to go there. I guess the practical point is, do I how do you make an interesting PhD project out of collecting a bunch of data in kind of this fashion, right? That's what I think about a lot in these kinds of perspectives, like clicking the same button 6 million times. You want to try to have like a fundamentally interesting approach here. And so I completely agree. It's just a matter of practical issues. And so
perhaps you could call it a treasure hunt.
a treasure hunt, there you go, yeah. I'll financially reward you at the end of the day. There you go, yeah. Fold it home. Great, thank you so much.